So just to get the conversation started, what we're going to do is maybe have 1 minute brief thoughts in terms of what you've seen today, what some of the key things are. And usually the conversation starts very quickly going through different directions as the comments come, and then we can sort of turn it into open mic form. Again, questions from the audience, and then actually back and forth. One thing, maybe I'll go ahead and start with Terry. In terms of the network's kind of complexity that's coming with the new hardware platforms, what are your thoughts? What do you see?
Well, this is very exciting. I'm impressed with how much investment Intel and a lot of these other companies are making. I know these chips are very expensive. Someone told me that an ASIC costs $10 million. Okay, he says yes. Okay, so you know that's it's an investment not just in hardware. It's an investment in resources that you have and thinking about what you want to put on a chip, what not put on a chip. And one of the problems, though, that I'm sure you're aware of it, is that neuroscientists don't actually know everything that's there. In other words, there may be something critical that we'll discover next year that will be important. But we know it's great to put in as much as we know is there. So that's really a really important step forward.
Yeah, I too am incredibly impressed. Those last 3 new chip architectures are all just incredibly amazing. And I know that these are decades of research, but it's just incredible to see how they've progressed, the directions they're taking, how stable and powerfully they've become as computational models.
Yeah, likewise. I'm just very impressed in how the hardware has progressed so quickly. And again, I'm just very interested in what kind of large-scale workflows can be put on these new architectures, not just deep learning, but other ways of thinking about other kinds of algorithms too.
Yeah, I'd echo the kind of large-scale workflows. I think, now that there's maybe a small group of people who are thinking about implementing algorithms and so forth on these chips and learning what they need to know in order to do it, I think what's going to happen is people are going to realize that, first of all, they're going to need things like Fred Rothganger was talking about, programming constructs, and then it's going to turn into things like learning operating systems, right? Which is really, you can think of the brain in that way. And so I think the advent of having these chips that can be, that have onboard learning is going to be huge in pushing in that direction.
Yeah, I must agree with the speakers before me. We have now seen different and rather major hardware systems for neuromorphic modeling, and what we need now is consolidation in the software space and the user access to these systems, so that if you put your model on one system, you can also reuse it on other systems and don't have to start learning from point zero again to get your model translated to another system.
Yeah, I'm mostly fascinated by the convergence I see. It used to be 20 years ago, Carbon-Mead on the one side, asynchronous analog sub-threshold, and on the other side, all the digital stuff. And now you have so much crossover and cross-pollination between the two fields. And what I'm mostly interested in is actually what some speakers have mentioned before today. What's the right level of, let's say, computational abstracts, computational paradigms that you need to take over from biology to build a really efficient, intelligent system in hardware? And I don't think we have an answer yet, but I see some convergence on that in the concepts we've seen today.
I'm going to make 2 points, if that's allowed. The first thing is that the intelligence that we're familiar with comes partly from operating our brains and partly from having brains that are well designed in the first place. So I hear a lot of discussion about whether or not the correct mode for operating an intelligent machine, it looks like deep learning. or looks like a spiking model. But maybe we should think more about building chips that do evolution so that they can help us to evolve the right models in the first place. So that's my first comment. Second comment, because panels are supposed to be provocative, I intend to be provocative. And Steve, I know, invited me here for this very reason. So I hear a lot in this forum about spiking models being efficient, in particular power efficient. I think in terms of implementation in silicon, that is far from obvious. In fact, I suspect it's completely wrong. It's a sort of mantra that because our brains are efficient and they use spikes, spikes are efficient. Spikes clearly not efficient as an information communication mechanism. So I wonder, why is this community so in love with spikes? I don't get it. For a start, I would say, what if you take each of your spikes and replace it by an edge? There you go. I've just halved the power consumption of all of your chips. Why are you so in love with spikes? I don't get it.
Great. So I have two comments. The first is, it seems like historically when we have different hardware, the algorithms are about to change, because when we calculate computational complexity, it's always relative to a particular type of model hardware. But when we change the model hardware, it's time to change the type of algorithms that we run. So I think that with enough change of the underlying architecture, I kind of see that it's getting there for the time for us to think also about different types of algorithms. The other point that I want to say about the spikes, this is something I was kind of sitting and thinking too. So Terry will kind of tell me if I'm right. So when we think about the brain, so I think many of the engineers think about spikes and information transfer and these things, and many of the pharmacologists think about soup of chemicals. So then it's not like one-to-one signaling, but it's kind of like analog, spatial, less focused transfer that change the properties of the network, of the neurons and the connection and whatever they have inside, and make them act differently. Where in current ways that we're thinking about, that we kind of forced the brain a little bit into the very engineering approach.
Well, I think that you've pointed out that at the bottom of my levels diagram that you didn't see.
We know your book, your first
is
book.
biochemistry. So within neurons, there is a chemical network of interacting proteins that have timescales that range from milliseconds out to many minutes. And I actually see the beginnings of that, for example, in the trace, which is something that the reinforcement learning algorithms use. That's clearly in neurons. It's the chemical soup that is keeping track of longer time constants. But one thing that I think we're going to see, and this is, I'm looking forward to this, is that if you think about where we were in the 60s when digital computers first became available generally at universities, was that it was like, what can we do with this architecture? And what it was good at was really doing logic really well. It wasn't very good at doing floating point back in those days. And so everybody looked under the lamppost, and that's where almost all the research was done, in that one architecture, that one model of computation. And we made a lot of progress, and here we are today. It's really fueled everything that we've seen. But the computational universe is immense. It's enormous. And now, for the first time, we're able to populate. It's like going from the solar system into another galaxy of computational, these large-scale computational spiking networks, which we're going to be able to explore with these chips. And it's going to happen, because of the fact that so much effort has been put into the hardware, and then the people now who are searching for what algorithms run well on this hardware, they're going to make discoveries that are going to be really quite remarkable. And regarding, why spikes, spikes, I think it's really something that nature originally needed to communicate with relatively, with wires that are relatively slow. I mean, it's kind of amazing that you can almost outrun an axon, many of the axons. But it turns out, interestingly, that's a design feature. Once you have that, it turns out that you could use time as its own representation within the brain. And you don't have to have buffers. You don't have to be able to, do all the fancy things that you do with caches and so forth in digital computing. You actually have the hardware, properties of the hardware, the myelination and so forth, that can be adjusted to keep track of all the timing and all of the layers of complexity that you put on top of it. And it's really something, and I alluded to the fact that we have traveling waves. Every single oscillation that has been recorded at the tip of a microelectrode, gamma oscillations, alpha, this is the first thing that was recorded with EEG, was an alpha oscillation when you close your eyes and relax. Well, all of those are not just synchronous oscillations, they're all traveling waves. The cortex is a medium, and traveling waves, just like radio waves and sound waves, carry information. And so I think that we're going to really, there's a whole new level here of complexity that we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, I definitely want to weigh in on the spike question. In fact, I have planning to say a few things about it on Thursday. But first, I guess as far as the question of the proliferation of new exciting architectures, it's definitely a really exciting time to be in computing right now because, for decades, Moore's Law has been working fine. I mean, obviously, we at Intel still believe Moore's Law is alive and well, but is definitely changing form, and we're having to invent new devices and new techniques to keep scaling. But also, for decades, neural networks didn't work, and then they suddenly started working. So the convergence of those two factors has really opened everyone's minds to just what, Terry, you were saying about this broad range of new algorithmic, new ways of doing computation. And by the way, the old rule book is starting to run into some trouble. So it's a great time to be exploring these new domains, and I'm confident we're going to find some great breakthroughs. Maybe it's not spiking neural network chips, but certainly that's a very interesting direction to be exploring now. And among a pretty short list of new, fundamentally different and compelling from kind of a first principles basis architectures, spiking neural networks are really, I would say, top on the list. Obviously, there's quantum, but quantum is still a ways out, but there's really not too much else. As far as spikes go, so spikes, I think, again, I'll talk about this on Thursday in my talk, but at the very microscopic level, it's very easy to see why they're efficient and why neurons use this. The sparsity is a fundamental property in the brain, and there's an asymmetry between sending a 1 or sending a 0, and it can use time as an encoding manner, and in doing that, you then get dynamic behavior where just the dynamics of the system is actually performing the computation. So computation is not just taking time as we think in terms of conventional computing. We want it to complete as fast as possible. Really, computing is happening with time in the brain and with a spiking model. As you jump up to a high level and you have spikes that are now encoded in 32-bit messages, it seems like there's some large overhead with that. But really, if you squint your eyes and look at it, at now the next level of abstraction, it still makes good sense because the natural state, you want that asymmetry in activity. Normally, you want things to be idle and inactive because obviously you don't have energy being consumed in that state. And then just the act of communicating is really performing computation. So regardless of that overhead per spike, it can be very efficient. So anyway, I'm sure we...
Maybe I'll just add.
Retort? Shall I?
Sure, go ahead.
Shall I respond? So I think what Terry and Mike both just said is that spikes encode the timing of events. So I kind of get that perhaps what we're trying to compute with is timed events. But to me, that doesn't mean spikes. I mean, in any charge transport-based technology, which is basically the one in your head and the one we make on silicon, it is clearly more efficient to use one edge to mark a timed event than it is to use two edges. So why spikes?
Can I jump in just for a second? I think Spike is. Go ahead.
Let's get some audience participation. I should apologise to all my neuromorphic colleagues for inviting Simon. He's attacking spikes. So, I did warn you. Nowhere in Spinnaker is there a spike in the sense of something that goes up and then goes down again. Okay. The spike is the original reason why we're modeling spiking systems is because that's how biology works, and we want to understand biology. And so omitting what appears to be an important characteristic of the biology seems like a bad start. But the issue about whether it's one edge or two is a red herring. Basically, a spike is abstracted as an event. It's encoded using address event representation in 32 bits, which does seem remarkably inefficient, but we have to multiplex because we can't build the same number of physical wires as the biology can construct. So really forget spikes. Think event-based processing. And I think if you go to one of the more important applications of these systems, computer vision, you look at the data rate out of a high-resolution frame-based imaging device, you look at the data rate out of an event-based vision device, and you can see where the power saving is immediately. The number of events you have to handle, the amount of data you have to handle goes down by orders of magnitude by having an event-based sensor, because frame-based vision is incredibly redundant. So that's the kind of basis of the energy argument. But, don't say spikes, say events, and then your two-edge argument evaporates.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, I tend to agree with you. I think a lot of the people, when they think spikes is all this time encoding and all that, also go completely with the event stuff. We need to be energy proportional in our task, essentially. So if we have a given task that has a given spatial temporal sparsity, then basically we need to exploit that sparsity in that sense. But that's kind of an abstraction level above. Yes, it's spiking, so we also do it in spiking. Because really for the Spinnaker 2 system, if I look at the energy figures, you've seen them up on the board, there's 3 orders of magnitude difference between the spike-based and the machine learning synaptic updates, and it's in the wrong direction. I mean, it's femtojoules for the machine learning. Just to finish this point, I also see a lot of the posters up in the room where people are saying it's spike-based, it may be top threshold, whatever, and it's energy efficient. But you never really put the figures there. I see a lot of, sorry to say it like that, I see a lot of stuff that's kind of not honest. I see incremental energy per spike update, not the real energy. If you look at ISSCC, if you look at the machine learning hardware, they take the entire power of the system, they take their AlexNet or whatever benchmark, and they divide the one by the other, and then they go to synaptic updates or teraops or whatever you want to call it. So if we really say our systems are more energy efficient, let's be honest about the comparisons, and let's compare it to industry standard and not just among ourselves.
Yeah, I must totally agree concerning this energy measurement. The only honest thing is to compare some performed function and measure at the plug. And we are not yet there, so we have to maybe shift this, postpone this discussion to nice conferences in the future when we have more measurement data, seeing which kind of system does some real application with most power efficiency. But on the other hand, spikes, I think you should not look at spikes at one spike alone. The important thing is the spatial sparseness, the hyperdimensional vector view of things. And this makes spikes incredibly powerful because they contain not only the temporal point when something happens, but they also address with very, very few bits the full range of data available in a vast system like the human brain. You have, for example, 1 million connections between two different parts of the brain, and you can definitely, with 10 spikes from this 1 million connection, you can really determine one vector reliably. So you can, in one dendrite with one NMDA, you can detect one specific part of information in a vast information space, which you cannot cover with a few floating point numbers. And this is only a few spikes you need for this. So if you consider spatial sparseness, also the hyperdimensional view of communication, then spikes are incredibly powerful and the only way to go.
Sorry, I'd add that it's spatial and temporal sparseness in terms of the network.
I wanted to focus to ask us again about the issue of energy. So in biological system, spike is taking some energy, but the real energy is the changes that happen between the neurons or in the synapses or the synaptic plasticity or other changes, adaptivity that happen. So most of the energy is actually there, not in actually working a fixed neural network. So I would kind of like to kind of bring up to the people who works on a hardware, how is it in their system, the actual spiking versus the changes that are occurring because of the spiking?
Could I add a little bit to the spiking debate? Just to that question, I think what's missing here is spikes are actually energy efficient for the biophysics that the neurons use. I don't know if there might have been studies that show that they are energy efficient for the electronics, but they might something else be energy efficient to represent events in the electronics. I'd be interested to hear if you know about that, if, again, biophysics, one thing is interesting and efficient, electronics, what comes out?
I think this discussion is all actually intertwined. The discussion about spikes and the criticism about benchmarking ultimately comes down to there just needs to be the proof. And at Intel, certainly that's the approach and the mentality we come to this. We're not necessarily interested in just publishing the best synaptic operation energies we can. In fact, when we characterize Loihi or any of our past chips, there's something like 12 to 15 different microarchitectural parameters, including plasticity operations, which all have different energies associated with them. Fixating on one particular number at this stage really, I think, is premature. And what matters is this point of find a workload that does something well-defined and compare entire system performance and energy to the best conventional approach. Now, we've actually done that in one case for a predecessor of Loihi, and we're still collecting the silicon data now for Loihi itself. And we found that with sparse coding, I'm again giving my Thursday talk now, but with sparse coding, lasso optimization, very well-defined mathematical optimization problem, we have found with spikes, event-based messaging, however you want to call it, on this neuromorphic architecture, we can outperform by orders of magnitude, 5,000 times energy delay product, a CPU running the best conventional solvers for that problem. Oh, wow. So that to us was the proof in our research program that spikes or event-based temporal coded signaling is efficient for the right types of problems. We don't know exactly what that space of algorithms is where this architecture provides value, but certainly it's non-zero. And so that's why we're exploring it.
So, benchmarks are very slippery because, if you pick the problem to run on your computer, you could move it around. In fact, someone once described, benchmarks on supercomputers as the least upper bound the computer is guaranteed not to achieve. And for most programs, they never achieve it, of course, unless you are, microcoding the thing. And so I think sure you need to have benchmarks, but I think it's more important to look at functionality. In other words, why don't we put numbers on the flexibility that it has? Like, for example, I think having on-chip learning is enormously more, it may not take that much more energy than another gate or something, but it's enormously more useful and powerful. And so I think there needs to be other dimensions and not just how many picojoules that it's being consumed.
Absolutely. That's our hope at certainly Intel with Loihi and future versions of that silicon, is that the adaptive online learning capability it's hard to quantify and benchmark because really there aren't many good solutions for that algorithmically today. At that point, there's no need to compare numbers, right? It's just obvious. But we're still a long way from that.
Quick question. Regardless of the efficiency discussion, are spikes fundamentally necessary to get to that holy grail algorithm that we're looking for, or not?
Can you tell us what the Holy Grail algorithm is?
Exactly, but normally we are looking at spiking and we're trying to implement deep learning with spiking, which is not necessarily what's happening really in the neocortex, right? So when I'm talking about the holy grail algorithm, I feel that we have all the ingredients, but we're kind of running circles around, not quite hitting the mark.
I think we'll be able to compare results in about 10 years' time. One thing I am sure of is that deep learning isn't it either. I mean, having to re-expose a simple convolutional neural network to the same data 100 times or 1,000 times is clearly not as efficient as the way we do things.
This is just the point that has come up in the previous workshops also. This actually goes to the sort of the holy algorithm, the ultimate algorithm question. Again, just to be controversial, what do you guys think? If, again, we build these systems, we operate them, they're functional, they're low power and everything else, but we might not be algorithmically describe what they're doing, how they're functioning. We might not use them for certain applications where you do need that absolute certainty that what it is. But lots of other applications, you don't really care what's inside as long as it's giving you the function. So, so again, these are maybe bifurcating applications where definite algorithmic certainty is needed, and other applications where it's functional, it's good, maybe it's good enough. Maybe that's really all we're looking for. So what would be your thoughts in terms of that definite algorithmic description that is out there, may be out there, it might not be out there? What do you guys see as potential direction that way?
I'm not sure this is going to answer the question, but so the way, if you're thinking in terms of algorithms and algorithms that you don't necessarily know how it's working, you know, along the machine learning side of things, it could be that it's going to be control theory and learning the right controls that's going to direct you, right? In other words, if you don't care what's happening, but you just want to get the right result, and you want to, you know, get the right result, but you want to reduce the power, and, you know, you're going to have things that are more complicated than what's in a standard backpropagation algorithm. And, you know, so then you're going to have to generalize the way you're thinking about your loss function and put in, you know, multiple different kinds of neurons that are doing different things, and, you know, put in your dopamine and, you know, rewards and lots of different things. And I think, but now, if you think about doing control theory, implementing an algorithm based on some control theory, we have the substrate to start to do that. And I think that's kind of exciting.
So I have one comment basically on that issue of, you know, how we actually really know the algorithm. And I think, yeah, it's true. You could say it's all, in the end, you want to solve a control problem. You don't care how. But, and Hava mentioned that in her talk, if you, for example, want to extrapolate rules that you learn in one domain to another domain, draw analogies and things like that, I think we need to think more about structured computations of neural networks. And I think this is one of the drawbacks also of deep learning right now, that it's this big soup and we don't really know. So I agree, in the end, we only care about the function, but for learning from few examples and things like that, drawing analogies, doing things that we see brains doing in people and animals, I think we should care about that, at least also, I mean, in the design at least.
I mean, maybe one remark to that. I was last week in an event with a lot of guys from automotive industry, and those guys, of course, extremely interested in functional safety, critical applications. They don't really care about mathematical theory behind what the network is doing. But what they don't want is basically the sensors here, the actors there, and one black box deep network in between. What they want is essentially sub-functionality. So same way as, for example, if you do chip design, you insert a scan chain to basically break down the complexity, dimensionality of the network in handleable parts. So that's what they're interested in, not some mathematical theory, but verification and verification access inside the network. So we need to think about basically really structuring the problem inside the network.
I can add to that. I'm collaborating with John Doyle at Caltech, who's a control theorist. And when he looks at the problem, that control problem, he sees it very differently, both from the way that neuroscientists look at it, but also from the perspective of traditional control theory. He was, by the way, one of the people behind H-infinity, which was, guaranteeing that your control model is going to work. And what's really exciting is that it looks as if nature has found a very different model in which you have layered control. You don't have one control system. What you do is you have the spinal cord, which does local control, reflexes, but sophisticated reflexes, like being able to run. A cat can run with its brain disconnected from the spinal cord. If you just put it on a suspend it, put it on a treadmill, it will have a normal natural gait, which means that the circuitry in the spinal cord has to be enough to be able to generate the gait. But that is then controlled from the midbrain, from nuclei and the cerebellum and so forth, projecting down to be able to modulate and to regulate. And then on top of that, at the very top level, there's the cerebral cortex, which of course does have control, voluntary control, but through learning, through basal ganglia learning, you can pass control from the voluntary down to the habitual, and so what you're doing is you're creating a whole kind of set of layers that are able to deal with sudden things that happen, like if you're on a mountain bike and you're going down and you get jostled, you don't have to think about that. You need to do that within 100 milliseconds, otherwise you're going to fall. But then you can look far ahead. Your visual system can plan, and that's way in the future, many seconds. It takes the visual system 100 milliseconds to make one decision, but that's okay if you have 5 seconds. And so that's at the top level, and then at the bottom level, and everywhere in between. And working out the theory of that is really going to be, I think, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing is that we learn to formulate this in a practical way so that we can have a kind of description language for what we are going to start with, and then it will train itself and we have to get back what it learned and have an incrementally changing description of the system, but a description we can somehow understand, that we can use our intuition to change things and improve the system. If we only have the black box, we will never achieve this. And that is what I meant before, that we need software at the moment, software to control our system, so that we have an interface between our thoughts and our systems.
Sorry, may I? So my point is that maybe getting inspiration within living neuronal structure is not well adjusted at the very beginning. If we are talking about control problem, right? So maybe we have to care more about how we actually downloading some motor skills. Like everyone who is getting lessons within music knows that it's really motor, right? So also we want something from machines, and actually getting inspiration is something that's quite different. Human brain, it's full of hacks, right? It's evolution. Every time it solves problem between specializing some existing regions with new function or growing the new one when it's clearly that existing region is not capable to deal with. So we're full of hack from even very beginning. Our RNA actually patched back our DNA, and we're fine with that, right? And also, how we can get inspiration from something what's really so buggy. I mean, also, point is that, okay, even if so, but talking about self-driving cars, I mean, having never wanted them to collide, to have a crash. So it means there is no environment for natural evolution, right? Self-driving car never gonna fail the consequences of a crash, right? And they're also not gonna eat each other. If you're talking about military robots, okay, maybe they are, but they're probably not gonna reproduce somehow and evolve. So that's why, and the final point, like, maybe first we have to build it and later get to know how it's working. I mean, like bicycle, the principles of cycling and counter steering, it's counterintuitive. And first we invent bicycle and later we learn how actually we're riding it, right? The same with airplanes, and our notion of love was clearly before we have a language, right? But we already had it. I mean, it was a love. So that's why maybe we, every time dealing with getting inspiration from something, what we think is perfect, have really to make some judgment and understand that some part of it may be not worth to copy or mimic at some level. So keep improving.
I wouldn't agree with you that the brain is filled with hacks, okay? It could never evolved, you know, over millions and millions of years, because you require that every species at every point has to survive to pass on the genes to the next generation. And there have to be principles. It could never have just added willy-nilly and random things, because you have to be able to have this progression. Actually, we don't know all the principles yet, and that's part of the problem. But we do know the principle of life. So there was a time when people were very confused about, you know, what is life? And the philosophers would go on for, you know, many debates and books trying to define what life is. But it wasn't until DNA was discovered in 1953, the structure of DNA, and that in itself was a real important principle, not just for understanding how proteins are produced, but also how they evolved through mutations and development, how the genes are turned on and off during development. So that formed the base, and without DNA, I don't think anything could have evolved on top of that. So that's what we're really, there's got to be something like DNA. It's not going to be a molecule, but there's got to be some basic principles, computational principles, and I think we're making progress. I too would be very disappointed if all we had 10 years from now was convolutional neural networks, but it's a stepping stone in the right direction. It's giving us a sense for why we should go in that direction, not necessarily to stop there, but to say, let's explore further. Let's find out, is there a principle, is there a theory for these parallel architectures that we could find that would help guide us? That's, I think, the first thing. Let me. By the way, if you look at any advance in science, it was always preceded by some engineer who went out and built it and got it to work. My favorite example is the steam engine. So James Watt, he's an engineer. He didn't have any background. In fact, the theory of thermodynamics didn't exist. He put it together and got it to work. It didn't work very efficiently, but it worked, and it powered the Industrial Revolution. Now, physicists came down later and said, well, we should figure this out, pressure, temperature, volume, and they came up with a very beautiful theory that allowed them to incrementally improve the efficiency and the performance of steam engines. Well, you know, in a sense, that's what these deep learning networks are, is basically something that was hacked together, and I believe that's the right word for a lot of these networks. And now we really have to have we'll find a theory. It won't remain a black box, because there are a lot of really smart mathematicians who are working on it now, figuring out, you know, what the representations are and how you describe them and the sparsity. And there's a lot of very important mathematical principles that will come out of it, and that's really what we're looking for.
I was just going to say that there is, I mean, in a sense, what we're hearing is the that old principle, build it and they will come, which normally to a chip designer doesn't make any sense at all because it's pretty expensive to design a new chip and there's a chance they won't come. So normally you don't do that. However, we live in strange times. This year, NVIDIA expect to sell $2 billion worth of GPUs for deep learning. My bet is at least half of those are going to be used just for research. In other words, we live in a time where this breakout of machine intelligence and the potential that it offers means that uniquely it is actually economically worth building machines for discovery. In other words, although we are just starting to deploy real machine learning and AI applications, that maybe isn't the bulk of the market. So you could build, whatever kind of new machine today with a chance that you might sell enough that it really was economically sensible. And I think the thing that would get in the way, the thing that you would have to get right, is that if you're going to sell it to people as a means of discovery, then it's got to be really easy to program. So the software story is probably pivotal there. If you make a platform that's wacky, but it's easy to program, then people will do a lot of exploring on it, and it won't seem so wacky anymore.
Well, see, Thomas J. Watson, the first president of IBM, was once asked, started this punch card company, they're going to build this computer. Well, what's the market in the world? And I think he said it was like 6. And the problem is that when you introduce a new technology, it's really impossible to imagine the impact, what it's going to be used for. And my favorite example is the internet. So, we used it back in the 80s for email, our ARPANET, and amongst the, government contractors, it was DARPA was ARPA back then. And in the 90s, it went commercial. And I have to say, could any of you have imagined the impact it would have on every aspect of commerce, of the music industry, social interactions, how it's changed everybody's life, and people are glued to their smartphones now. I mean, for better or for worse. But the point is that nobody predicted that. And I think that when you introduce new technology, you just can't predict. It's just we don't have a good enough brain to be able to work out all the possibilities. And it also depends on economics. It depends on marketing. It depends on so many other factors that have to do with the intangibles.
Yeah, so a little different question. So we have seen that now quite extensively now, I think, is deep learning model is extremely brittle with adversarial images. Any small magnitude, human imperceptible changes on the images can totally break or fool the deep net. And there are a lot of attacks happening on the deep net in the literature. So, and that is kind of really scary for me, as all the workloads in future are going to be deep learning maybe in very soon. So my question is, but in our human brain, we always get 100 out of times 100 correct. We never, means it doesn't fool all these adversarial images, never fool our human brain. So maybe it needs to be proved, but my question is, what is your expectation that this brain-inspired computing or spiking neural network model, do you think it would be totally immune to those adversarial images and it would be a more safer, interpretable AI in that direction compared to DeepNet?
My guess about the adversarial type and deception of machines, I think that as long as we're working only on the low level, there will be lots of deception. I think that before we start building models, and it doesn't matter if these neurons spike or do not spike, I think the deception will be very similar. It's true that many of the examples that we see now for deception are based on gradient, but I don't think it matters. I think you can write probably a letter, to nature with the decepting, spiking neural network, and I'm sure that it will work. And it's not about the basic building block. I think it's about putting different parts together, kind of like a whole brain with different parts, with the model building, with the top down, with the bottom up, with different parts and safety, that otherwise things will still be tricked. It actually, it's a very interesting, I think, issue that tricking neural network is different than tricking humans. They have different weaknesses. It's just a very interesting thing, that every machine and every material have its own weaknesses. Anybody want to talk to that?
I'll just represent as a student of John Doyle's. I think that there's certainly, every time we engineer something to be robust to one feature, then it becomes fragile to another, right? There's these sort of universal trade-offs, he would say, if he was here. So my question, I guess, broadly to the panel is about synthesis methods. And by synthesis, I mean in the context of control. So my background's in synthetic biology. I mostly do prokaryotic synthetic biology, design of multicellular systems, design of polycultures, et cetera. And I think there's fascinating parallels between how layered neural net architectures implement complex functional approximation, control design, et cetera, in the same way that synthetic prokaryotic systems with their multi-layered transcriptional networks implement extremely complex control functions with polymodal response. So, it can subsist in 7 different types of sugar. It has abilities to switch over from one to another, right, with a relatively quick time. So there's hierarchical control. There's certainly a synthesis problem that's been solved, and all using transcription factors that have activation functions that are very similar to sort of the squasher functions or the activation functions that we have in neural nets. So, okay, so here's my question. What, as a control theorist, H-infinity, H2 synthesis methods represent the solution to a specific set of equations, but they can also be formulated as an optimization problem, in particular a semi-definite programming problem, right? And so it becomes the solution after some iterative optimization, but on the other hand, a different representation, it's the exact solution of some equation, right, the algebraic Riccati equation. To me, I'm not familiar with a whole body of nonlinear control synthesis methods, especially in the context of leaky integrate fire, representations, neurons. What sort of tools does the community at large currently, you guys are the experts, have to bring to bear in terms of synthesis methods for controller design, and frankly for data representation, I think. So system identification and control. So that's my question.
So, that's a work in progress. Like I said, I'm working with John Doyle to actually do that, to look at the networks from that perspective. But it's an interesting point you make, which is that if you look at the biophysical interactions between proteins and DNA transcription factors, basically they're sigmoids. It's energy binding, and there's on rates and off rates that come from that. And so in some respects, and this is an irony, it turns out that the early neural network models, which go back to the Boltzmann machine and also the sigmoid used in backprop, that's actually a much better mathematical structure, mathematical framework for modeling the biochemical interactions that are occurring inside of cells. And the reality is that cells are probably as complicated as the brain in many respects, in terms of thousands of interacting proteins and incredible complexity. A macromolecular complex could have 20 proteins and incredibly regulated, and that all evolved over hundreds of billions of years back to bacteria. But it's in a sense, if you can ask the same questions about cells. I mean, cells are incredibly good at homeostasis, at regulation, and being able to adapt to new environments. And also they're lifelong in many respects too, in the sense that they have to be able to take in new signals coming from the outside and then adapt appropriately. Bacteria, by the way, are by far the most successful species, set of species, because they've invaded every niche of the world. I mean, they're in the desert, they're in ice, their archaea are down these plumes back in the ocean, these very hot plumes coming out from volcanic activity. But, you know, and I think this is a more general issue, which is that we don't really understand cells or brains yet well enough to be able to, except in a few special cases like the vestibular ocular reflex, which controls your eye when you move your head so that it stabilizes the image. We do understand that. It's a feed-forward system, and it's very well adapted in the sense that it's always being adjusted. We understand a few systems having to do with the way that you control your limb. Some theories, in fact, Ben-Ha, is he here? He has a really beautiful control theory to explain a lot of the irregularities in hand motions. It was his thesis, PhD thesis, in my lab. And now he's working on spiking neural networks, right? So he saw the light. And what's, I think, really, I think some of the concepts that are coming from control theory will really have a huge impact on understanding the 99% of the brain that we're not modeling yet. Like I say, there's hundreds of mechanisms for plasticity in different neurons in different parts of the brain, solving control problems, solving homeostatic problems, solving survival problems in terms of food. You know, how do you deal with starvation? How do you deal with a threat from a predator? These are all problems that nature has developed specialized circuits for being able to handle them in a very flexible and a fail-safe way. In other words, you don't want it to be fragile. If it's going to break, you're dead. So it has to be able to fail safe. In other words, you have to be able to crawl away.
So my PhD advisor is a control theorist, Eduardo Sontag. So from his point of view, the word is control. But I don't think so. I don't think that even that we think about the brain as a controller of, the body and everything. I think that control is a very momentary view of the full system, both for cell and for brain. So you can even see it in the algorithm. So if you're talking about optimal control, or we're talking about adaptive control. So in adaptive control, you move something to solve it now, but you don't have a reason to have memory of things that you had in the past. So it's a particular important part of the system, but I would reject the suggestion that the brain is a controller, although I hear it all the time. I think it's a very interesting, momentary, good description, but not a full description.
I would say it must be solving some element of system identification, right, as well. So it's taking data and representing. Oh, sorry. Sorry, guys. I'd just say I would agree with that, Hava, that it must be solving some element of data representation as well, right, and doing system identification to sort of build abstractions of the world around it. It must be doing some element of verification. And I think there is some element of dynamic synthesis where it's actually rewiring and building new controllers, right? And I think that sort of speak to some of the things that are happening when we're dreaming and when we're sleeping. I mean, we still don't understand, I think, what's happening there. So I agree.
I'd like to make a comment on that, if it's all right. Let's pull back a level. I take exception to the notion that the brain is a controller. But maybe not in the way that we're talking about right now. When we talk about the notion of life, one of its essential characteristics is the homeostasis. It's the sustenance of a system within a certain range of its state space. And I would offer that the reason brains exist in animals is to hold it within a certain range in its state space. So I think that it is a controller in that sense. Not in the narrow sense if I'm trying to learn controller so I can walk, but that it is an important part of my organism to keep me within a narrow range of my state space. And that is the primary principle from which things that we call intelligence derive.
So, sorry, I just wanted to add one thing that's interesting is that if you look at the brain, when people do fMRI experiments or other lesion experiments, the areas that do particular things are all identifiable from one person to another. And so somehow I think that that must come from an evolutionary setup, which is setting up a skeleton on which control can be done. In other words, people adapt this way and that way. They learn different languages, but they still use Broca's area or Wernicke's area, and they still have, you know, motor cortices, but they are, you know, ski jumpers or they're runners, right? And so all of those things are adaptable, but there's this skeleton on which these adaptations are occurring. So, you know, clearly some of the parameters are set by evolution and genetics, but then other ones are plastic, so, you know, so that you can keep your, so homeostasis, you can keep yourself in the living part of the state space.
Yeah, I think we generally totally underestimate the amount of things predefined in the genes. There are a lot of experiments modifying genes in mice, and you see if you even change the dynamics of one plasticity variable a little bit, usually the mice has severe defects. So we have to be more humble and look at nature and learn. And
Yeah, I agree 100%. And for those of you who actually want to follow up on this, I'd like to point out that Simon Haken, who is a adaptive signal processing engineer, who's written many books, by the way, has helped develop a new field, something called cognitive radio. Has anybody heard about this? So this is using adaptive signal processing to improve the use of the bandwidth for cell phones, for example. And what he's found is that you have to be able to make predictions about the usage levels. And to be able to make predictions, you have to have something that looks like, you know, a brain. And the idea, though, is that as you are making a better model of the usage pattern, you could optimize that and then get much more you know, profit. And so that it's become a big deal in the telecom business. There's also cognitive radar. And the idea there is that you just don't blindly send out signals. You adapt the signal you're sending out according to the feedback you're getting. And in fact, that's what bats do. You know, they're chirping, and then they zoom in on what their target that they have, and as they come in, it's always being modulated as they come closer and closer. And then there's even a cognitive power grid. Again, load balancing. How do you solve that problem? We have an ancient system that doesn't work very well. But you know, if you put layers of control, which involve smarter and smarter ways of being able to regulate the flow of power through the grid, you can get it much more efficient.
What applications do you have, civilian applications for cognitive radar?
How many, what applications?
Civilian applications, not military applications.
This is for my, you know, this is now actually getting into use in actual power radar installations, and it's when you're tracking things, airplanes that have to track targets, missiles coming at them, and you know, it's just in a sense, it's making our instruments a little bit more intelligent. I mean, I wouldn't call it, it's not human intelligence, obviously, but it's making, and actually the word that I haven't heard here very much is predictions. Making predictions. I mean, that is really the key to survival, is predicting where is the food going to be tomorrow. Predicting how is somebody going to react if I say something, right? And that's what we're always doing at many different levels, and I think that's what brains are particularly good at. Right, where's the food coming?
So actually, on that note, let's thank the panelists again. One more question, so sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Hi, I think I have a high-level question. I think, you know, brain is such an amazing entity, and there's so many things to study about it. So there's definitely a fantastic scientific opportunity. But so my question is more from the engineering side, right? I think from engineering side, we want to build something. We want to build a new hardware or whatever you call it, some new system, then that system, the goal must not be just to replicate exactly every aspect of the brain. Not, I mean, even if you think it as a black box, you know, its form factor, its functionality. So there must be, as engineers, we're building something that's brain plus, right? So I'm wondering, what is that plus factor? Are we building something that can function exactly like the brain, but it's programmable, it can function faster, or it's not able to hack it, or you know, it's not bothered by emotion? You know, what is that plus, and what do you think are the plus factor that's the most critical?
Oh, okay, so first of all, I think it's foolish to try to make a perfect model of the brain. I mean, mothers do that all the time. I mean, you know, you don't need a supercomputer to do that. And in fact, it's not necessary. It's just there's so much more there that you're not necessarily interested in. But that having been said, in fact, the Human Brain Project got off the ground with exactly that as its goal from Henry Markram, right? I mean, am I right? Okay, they're not shaking their heads. Okay, the Europeans are. I mean, but you know, I think he was misinterpreted. He didn't actually want to recreate the brain, but to extract from it some basic principles, just the way that scientists have done that over and over again, is once you've understood a principle, you could implement it in many different ways and help improve devices, help create new appliances that you can now use. And by the way, one of the important things to keep in mind is that there are many different questions you can ask about the brain, and out of the millions of different details, you may only be a few of them that were relevant for answering the question. And this is something that's familiar from physics. For example, you know, let's just take a lump of iron and it rusts. You know, what's an incredible amount of chemistry and the detail of, you know, why is it change color, and what the feel has changed, everything has changed, the structure and so forth. But if you just want to understand magnetism, you only need to understand the fact that there's these unpaired spins. And you can come up with a beautiful theory to explain how magnetism works, right? So if you're interested in magnetism, only of all the details is that one physical detail about the unpaired spin that you can now align in grains. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the parts, you know, the questions that we can ask about the brain that will reveal something about its function that will lead to a principle that will allow us to build things that have that capability.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the scientific part of it, right? But then you want to apply the principle to build something that's even better in some aspect.
And that's what we're counting on you to do.
I think there are two, these aren't my ideas, there are two oft-quoted advantages that a machine intelligence would have that we will never have. One is the ability to take learning from one machine brain and put it into another one, so that we don't have to keep repeating the same education every time we make a new brain. And the other is to take the learning from multiple brains and merge them into one other one. So those are the two pluses in my book, apart from just producing bigger brains.
Those are really contingent on representation.
I'm sure they are.
So with that, let's thank the panelists again.